By 2026, America was exhausted. Decades of debt, endless wars, bitter divisions, and a government that seemed to serve itself more than the people had left half the nation numb. Citizens no longer expected real change. They shrugged, they scrolled, they turned away. Hope had been replaced by resignation. And then came the breaking point. A president tested the limits of power, forcing a digital ID, pushing a new currency that threatened to upend the U.S. economy, and treating the Constitution not as a guide, but as an obstacle. For some it was alarming, for others just more noise. But history remembers this moment differently. It was the spark. It didn't come from Washington or Wall Street. It didn't come from a billionaire, a general, or a celebrity. The spark came from an ordinary citizen in the Midwest, someone with no wealth, no power, no platform, who dared to ask a question everyone else had forgotten. What if the Constitution's preamble wasn't just an aspiration? What if it was the law? At first, almost no one listened. The idea seemed too radical, too simple, too naive. But as the storms of the late 2020s grew darker, domestic unrest, authoritarian overreach, even the specter of a new world war, that spark began to spread. Slowly at first, then all at once. People saw that the preamble was not decoration. It was a blueprint for survival. Bind government not only by restrictions, but by obligations. Require it to prove, with every action, that it must serve the people's highest goals: justice, tranquility, unity, welfare, true defense, and liberty for all. That is the idea that caught fire. By 2031, those words are no longer dismissed as dreams. They are binding law. And with that change, America itself changed course. This is the story of how the nation was saved, not by a politician or a party, but by an idea. And like every great turning point in history, it began with a spark. Initially, every great idea encounters resistance, and the push to make the preamble enforceable law was no exception. At first, the ridicule was everywhere. Politicians dismissed it as naive. Legal scholars called it unconstitutional. Media pundits laughed it off as fantasy. Even neighbors and family scoffed. Nice idea, but it'll never happen here. But the louder the resistance grew, the clearer it became that this idea had teeth. Because if the preamble really was nothing more than decoration, why were so many in power so afraid of it? Why fear a standard that simply asked for justice, tranquility, defense, welfare, and liberty? That fear was proof of significance, and it gave the idea oxygen. By the late 2020s, small groups began to form. Teachers, veterans, students, retirees. They weren't wealthy, they weren't powerful, but they were stubborn in the way only ordinary people can be when they finally see the truth. They built websites, streamed from their kitchens, passed flyers in church basements and union halls. Their message was simple: America cannot endure if its government is bound only by profit-fueled limits, but never by duty. Then came the breakthrough. Lawyers and scholars, some retired judges, others disillusioned young clerks, quietly joined. They argued the preamble wasn't a flourish, but the heartbeat of the republic. Without it, the body withers. By 2027, the first lawsuits appeared. They did not yet demand a new law, but they challenged policies that ignored the preamble's promise of justice, tranquility, and welfare. Most cases were dismissed, yet each filing left a mark. Each seeded the idea that maybe, just maybe, the government had forgotten its true job description. History remembers this as the moment the whisper became a flame. The point when an idea began turning into a movement. Every movement has a turning point. The moment when it stops being dismissed and starts being feared. For the Preamble movement, that moment came in the late 2020s. The country was fraying. Inflation was rising, debt was soaring, and trust in institutions had sunk to historic lows. Abroad, America was stretched thin. At home, factional violence threatened to spill into something worse. And then came a breaking point. A crisis so undeniable, so costly, that even skeptics began to ask whether the old way of governing could survive it. In that chaos, the idea of binding government to the Preamble no longer seemed naive. It seemed necessary. If leaders could not be trusted to act in the people's interest voluntarily, they had to be compelled by law. The question shifted. It was no longer, is this realistic? It became, how much longer can we survive without it? And it was here that the media played its part. At first, coverage was sparse and dismissive. Local papers noted small meetings with polite curiosity. Online forums debated the idea as a thought experiment. But then, a turning point of a different kind. A short video of a volunteer explaining the Preamble's importance went viral. Simple, clear, undeniable. Algorithms carried what pundits ignored. Suddenly, millions were talking about the Preamble in living rooms, classrooms, and union halls. Journalists followed. Some wrote in support, others in criticism, but all acknowledged the same thing. Ordinary citizens had forced a national conversation. Headlines began connecting government failures to the Preamble's unmet promises: justice, tranquility, welfare. Each story carried the idea further, until the movement could no longer be dismissed as fringe. By 2029, it had become impossible to ignore. Talk shows, newspapers, online media, all carried the debate. The narrative had shifted. Citizens were no longer passive observers. They were participants, demanding a government accountable to its original job description. Through crisis and coverage, the spark became a flame. What began quietly in basements and community halls now pulsed through the center of American society. And history is clear. When ideas are carried by both necessity and momentum, they do not fade. They thrive, and they reshape the course of nations. By 2030, the Preamble movement was no longer a whisper or curiosity. It had reached the halls of power. Members of Congress and the Senate could not ignore the swelling demand for accountability. For the first time in generations, ordinary citizens were asking their leaders to prove, not just promise, that government served the people's highest aims. And with attention came resistance. Entrenched interests reacted defensively. Some lawmakers dismissed the movement as idealistic. Others launched attacks, questioning motives, smearing organizers, and obstructing hearings. Headlines twisted the message, exaggerating fears and framing the demand for accountability as a threat to stability. The media, hungry for controversy, amplified the noise. Citizens who turned on the television often saw not the clarity of the Preamble, but caricatures of extremism or division. Yet outside that echo chamber, something else was happening. In churches, schools, union halls, and living rooms, Americans continued to gather. They debated, organized, and pressed their representatives to answer the only question that mattered. Why shouldn't the Preamble, the nation's mission statement, be binding law? The backlash grew fierce. Powerful lobbies warned of economic collapse. Partisan voices predicted chaos. Yet for every dismissal, every distortion, the idea spread further. Rallies filled public squares. Town halls overflowed with citizens demanding their leaders confront the words they had long taken for granted. Progress was not painless. The struggle revealed a fundamental tension. The Preamble's mission, so simple in words, yet so profound in meaning, threatened to hold everyone accountable. And then, history changed. After months of debate, public hearings, legal challenges, and relentless citizen pressure, Congress voted, and the Preamble became law. The nation had, at last, enshrined its mission into binding legal authority. Ordinary citizens had compelled the powerful to listen. The Preamble was no longer invisible. It had become the focal point of national governance, a mirror reflecting both the flaws of the old system and the possibilities of a new one. But passing the law was only the beginning. As political battles intensified, it became clear that the Preamble needed more than words on a page. It needed guardians. Without enforcement, even the most sacred law could be ignored. Out of that realization came a bold proposal: the fourth branch of government. Its mission was simple, yet revolutionary: to monitor, measure, and guide every government action against the standards of the Preamble. The idea was met with both awe and alarm. Critics warned of overreach. Some feared a new bureaucracy more powerful than the old. Supporters countered that without enforcement, the Preamble would remain a decoration, not a duty. The nation, strained by crisis, could no longer afford promises without accountability. Designing the fourth branch became one of the great debates of the era. How independent should it be? How would compliance be measured? How could citizens see in real time whether their leaders were serving justice, tranquility, unity, welfare, defense, and liberty? By the close of 2030, a blueprint had emerged. Every law, every policy, every act of governance would face a measure, a Preamble compliance rating, visible to the people themselves. Oversight and transparency were no longer abstract ideals. They were becoming a system. It was ambitious. It was unprecedented. It was risky. But for millions of Americans, hope now outweighed fear. The fourth branch promised not only accountability, but a rebirth of trust in the very idea of government. When the fourth branch came online, the nation held its breath. For the first time in history, government policies were not just debated or delayed, they were measured. Every law, every budget, every agency action now faced the same question: did it uphold the Preamble law? The first enforcement cases became national events. Millions tuned in as long-ignored issues, spending priorities, defense policies, the protection of welfare and justice, were tested against America's founding mission. Some policies were corrected immediately. Others triggered fierce debate, reform, or outright repeal. Early cases dealt with crises the government had long mishandled. Food processing methods was exposed as a violation of the people's welfare. The UN's open borders was struck down for undermining liberty. Unjust wars in Iraq and Afghanistan forced the government to redirect resources toward unity and defense of the people, not offense abroad. Each ruling sent shock waves through the nation. Not everyone welcomed the scrutiny. Some officials resisted. Entrenched interests fought back. But the consequences of ignoring the Preamble soon became undeniable. When a government failed its Preamble compliance rating, the people knew it and demanded change. For the first time in decades, citizens saw tangible accountability. They saw overreach checked, corruption exposed, and policies reshaped by principle instead of politics. These first tests were not smooth. They were not easy, but they were necessary. And as history records, they gave the fourth branch and the preamble itself the legitimacy it needed to endure. The nation was learning a new rhythm: accountability, transparency, and alignment with its founding aspirations. The big tests proved that the preamble was no longer just words. It was law, and law, at last, had teeth. The transformation in America did not go unnoticed. Around the world, leaders, scholars, and citizens watched with curiosity, skepticism, and in some places, envy. Massive demonstrations erupted in Spain, France, and the UK, where citizens demanded their leaders adopt preamble-style accountability. Some governments feared the example, worried it might inspire reform at home. Others embraced it, recognizing the potential for stability and renewed cooperation. Alliances were re-evaluated, treaties were rewritten. Diplomacy began to shift from power plays to principle. At the same time, global crises in the Middle East, leading to mass migration of millions of people, made the urgency of such change undeniable. In the end, America's choice became a mirror for the world. Proof that governance guided by principle, not expediency, could reshape a nation and perhaps the course of history. Citizens everywhere began to ask the question once whispered only in classrooms: what if our countries too lived by their founding promises? Looking back from 2031, the lessons are clear. America faced an unprecedented challenge: to reclaim its founding ideals amid chaos, apathy, and resistance. It succeeded not through the will of a few powerful figures, but through the vision, determination, and engagement of its people. The preamble, once an aspirational text, became law. The fourth branch ensured compliance. Society gradually aligned with the founding mission: justice, unity, tranquility, general welfare, and liberty. Civil unrest was mitigated, crises managed, and a foundation laid for a more accountable, compassionate, and stable nation. History will remember this decade not as one of chaos, but as a turning point, a testament to the power of ideas, the courage of ordinary citizens, and the enduring promise of the Constitution. And as we reflect on these events from 2031, the question remains: what other sparks lie dormant, waiting for someone to ignite them?